let's talk about stakeholder maps. Megan, what is a stakeholder map?
A stakeholder map is a way for you to create a picture of all the people who are involved in the system that you're thinking about.
Okay, so if I was going to build, let's say, an application to take a food order as a restaurant, who would be some of the stakeholders that I'd be thinking about?
Well, of course we know that the people who are actually going to be ordering are probably going to be your key stakeholders. So that's a pretty easy one. But then there are other people involved in that system that we want to make sure that we understand, know, name, and account for, right? So your servers, maybe the people who work in the kitchen at the restaurant. Maybe it's important for us to know people like who delivers the food to the restaurant, who works at the front desk in the restaurant. Maybe for some reason it would be important for us to list on that map all of the other businesses that are around the restaurant and make sure that we account for them too, right? We're trying to think about all of the people who might be directly or indirectly affected by our solutions.
Okay, great. So a stakeholder map, in summary then, is an organizational tool to figure out who's involved with a service or a product, whether they are providing, creating, or sourcing really anything along the entire chain of delivering a service. Is that fair to say?
I think it is.
So I could say farmers are part of the stakeholder map for a restaurant?
They might be.
Oh, interesting. What about the delivery and transportation companies?
Yeah, I think they can go on there.
Okay, well, let me ask you a tougher question. So I understand how people that go to a restaurant are involved, and the chefs and cooks and owners. I even understand how farmers obviously play perhaps the most critical role of taking things, from the fields and putting them on the table right to the fork. But I guess I'd wonder, maybe you were hinting at this earlier, what are the other types of businesses that might influence building an application for a restaurant? Would I be thinking about, food delivery services? Could people that are not necessarily part or employed of the restaurant's core business still be present on my stakeholder map?
That's right. And even people that might actually be building the application itself could have a place on the stakeholder map. So we're really trying to think about anyone involved in this process from start to finish who fits into this world. That's going to change depending upon what kind of solutions we're thinking about. It may also change depending upon what kind of system that we're thinking about.
Interesting.
The goal is to get everyone out there on the screen and then start making some decisions about who is really relevant to the project or to the process. And then we put those people on the map.
Okay, great. And is this something that I start with, that I end with, that I do in the middle, that I do throughout the process? When do I start thinking about using this organizational tool?
So a stakeholder map is a great way to get started with a project. It can also become a document that we look back at throughout the project. We may learn some things in the course of doing our work that make us make some changes to the stakeholder map. So it can be a dynamic thing that shifts and changes over time.
Okay, great. All right, well, that was a really nice orientation. Let's go ahead and jump into the template itself and figure out where and how we might manipulate this.
That's awesome.
Because this is one of our first template patterns, I want to orient everyone to just a couple of things that are already on the board. First is the Get Started video. This is universally the place somewhere on a board you're going to see Megan and I ultimately weigh in on what in the heck you're looking at and ultimately how you navigate. So let's start by looking, of course, at the board. The board will have at least 3 elements: the Get Started video, a navigation frame back to our central hub, and of course the template itself. So the video, placed differently throughout the board, will likely be somewhere close to the top left, although we reserve the right to move it wherever it can be ultimately best absorbed.
That's right, and you can move it as well.
Well said. The Need More Help is a direct link back to our hub. This is where we can revisit mechanics around Miro, play around with our icebreakers or our getting started templates, and of course learn new habits as they evolve, and of course navigate to other patterns and templates just like Stakeholder Map.
That's right.
The frame itself that you see me highlighting now is ultimately where we're gonna do our work. Quick refresher for everybody that you can zoom way in and zoom way out on a Miro board, being quite literally a universal whiteboard. Next is there's going to be an orientation or instruction section. This will be largely found on the left-hand side, but not universally. It will be the least number of steps that Megan and I and some other experts have put together in order to help you guide and make the most of this particular template. In this case, with a stakeholder, we have a step number 1, which is organized and numerically labeled over on the right-hand side about where we're gonna brainstorm all of our stakeholders, and then a step number 2 about how we're gonna organize those stakeholders. Now, Megan, The organizing step number one in a sandbox or a parking lot looks relatively straightforward from our work. I'm assuming many like you are, we're going to take our Post-it notes and just place them as we generate. But is there a method to the madness? Is there an order that we should start in, or do we just try to dump our brain in front of everyone on this frame?
I like to have people dump their brains and just really start to get as many stakeholders out of their heads as possible so we can see what the whole list is.
Now, should I start organizing them right from the beginning, or should I just dump them all in the beginning and then start organizing them?
Let's have people dump and then organize later.
Okay, what happens to the average person if they start to get too focused on organization too early?
Right, so dumping and organizing are kind of two different things that our brain has to do. And so we want to allow our brains to focus on one thing at a time. So first dump, then organize.
Well said. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and dump all of our stakeholders. If we're using our restaurant example, we might edit one of our Post-it notes to say patrons, right? And another one might be chefs or servers or delivery people or anything in between. Now, below that, we actually have the organizational phase. Now, Megan, we've ultimately organized this a little bit like a bracket. What goes in the middle? What goes in the first tier? What goes in the second tier?
So in the middle of your stakeholder map, you probably want to have the person who is going to be most affected by your solution, most effective by the product or service that you're thinking about or the strategies that you're building. Your target audience.
All right, so let's take out one variation of how we might be able to organize stakeholder maps. Now, in my variation, I put the product, service, or program, the experience that I'm designing around in the center. This is because my brain ultimately needs to constantly be reminded about where my North Star is and who is ultimately being impacted about this experience. Then I put my most critical stakeholder in my upper left Post-it note. This is not necessarily a mandate. It's a way that I visually communicate to myself, or those of us that can see red, around who I really need to make sure is my guiding force when I'm developing, asking questions, doing research, or shaping an experience. The next three most critical stakeholders is who I organize around my first tier, and any related stakeholders that I have brainstormed in the first section that we put in our sandbox ultimately will appear then in these various and related sections. So if I, for instance, had chef in my first Post-it note, I would then introduce the idea of maybe a line cook that follows on and other related stakeholders that are ultimately connected to but not overlapping with the original stakeholder. And again, this can go out over time. What I've accomplished is a product or service in the center, maybe it's an ordering or delivery app, and all of the key stakeholders, including residential customers, as well as employees, as well as supply chain, providers or farmers that are on my mix. Now, Megan, I've gone ahead and filled in stakeholder map number 1. Why don't we move into stakeholder map number 2 and see if there's other ways to utilize these patterns and tools?
Awesome. So Adam, sometimes instead of putting the product, service, or program at the center of your stakeholder map, you could choose to put your key target at the center of your stakeholder map. So as we were designing a system for ordering from a restaurant, maybe I want to put takeout patrons at the center of the map. And then we can start to think about the stakeholders who are directly related to them, and then the stakeholders who are sort of secondarily related to those people at the outskirts of the board.
Yeah, well said, Megan. And there's a third stakeholder map here. And the way I use a series of stakeholder maps is actually taking inventory of my stakeholders every 3 to 6 months.
Oh, cool.
So I'm asking myself, with this delivery app, are the same people influencing the experience today as they will in 6 months? So 6 months from now, it might turn out that there's a new delivery service, or there might be a different population that has moved into the area. And it could be unfortunate things like an Air Force base closing, or it might be a really fortunate thing like a new corporation comes to town and employs an awful lot of people. The idea is I use stakeholder maps not just centered around the experience or around the major persona, but also to show over time how and when the major actors in my system of experiences are ultimately evolving.
Awesome.
So we've talked a little bit about instructions, our sandbox to ultimately organize and dump our brains into, as well as a series of alterations on stakeholder maps. Now, in the top right-hand corner of our template or board, we see an example output of the stakeholder map. This may or may not apply to your product or service, but we wanted you to have some early ideas, albeit simple, just to get the ball rolling. And again, we're eager to hear your feedback. Stakeholder maps will certainly evolve over time. We're already hearing about stakeholders, not just including the humans, but also systems and bots and other actors that may be on the board in the future. But for now, enjoy the opportunity here for the pattern of stakeholder maps. Start by dumping your brain, organizing into templates and patterns, whether you put the persona, the product or service in the center, and ultimately share back how and when you change this if you're focused on technology, a literal service, or of course, anything in between. Megan, anything else you wanted to offer everybody about how to make the most out of the stakeholder map?
I think the most important thing is that people have fun with these templates and use them to fit whatever project that they're working on.
Well said. So, have fun with the stakeholder map. Remember, instructions on the left-hand side, prompting video in the top left-hand corner. The hub link will always get you back to the mechanics and the basics of Miro, as well as other patterns like the stakeholder map, and we'll look forward to hearing your feedback. Please don't hesitate to let us know how or when we can make this better.